In Luke chapter 10, there's a lawyer that stood up in verse 25 and put Jesus to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" He was going to see if Jesus could answer his question, thought that was maybe a stumper. And Jesus, as he often did, directs the man to answer his own question by looking at what the scriptures say. He says in verse 26, "And he said to him, 'What is written in the law, how does it read to you?'" Obviously, the law is going to give the answer to any question like this, and he needs to analyze it and answer it for himself. He can answer his own question if he'll look at the law. What does the law say? What is it that we have to do to inherit eternal life? And the man said, and he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." He gave a perfect answer to the question, showed that he had studied the scriptures quite a bit and he had understood what was really essential. To love God with everything you've got, all your heart, all your emotions, all the soul, all the strength and vitality you have, all the strength, all your drive, all your energy, all the mind, all your understanding. All parts of you need to love God. That's the most important thing. It clearly is. That's the number one command. And your neighbor is yourself. That's the second part of that, and that's the other thing. When you fill out the details of those two things, loving God and loving your neighbor, you have all the law. That's what all of it is, application of those two principles. So Jesus, when he said, "You have answered correctly," acknowledges that was right. He knew the truth before he asked Jesus. And he said, "Do this and you will live." Was he trying to say that it wasn't just enough to know what the chief commandment of the law was, but that he needed to do it? You know, sometimes it's easier to discuss it or to theorize about it or to study about it than it is to practice it. Well, that's true with a lot of things. The practice is the hard thing. A lot of times the understanding of it is not that difficult. This is pretty easy to understand, but it's hard to do. So you've got to practice what you preach. So Jesus says, "Do this and you will live." But wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" I am not sure what it means by wishing to justify himself. Was he trying to save face because Jesus responded with an answer so basic that it made him look kind of stupid for asking the question in the first place? Was he wishing to justify, it's not that easy now, who is your neighbor? Or was he trying to justify not having done it? Was he thinking that he wanted to know where the limit was, where he got to stop with this? You know, maybe he's looking for some way to get out of having to love all his neighbors. And so Jesus tells a story to answer who is my neighbor. And in fact, the next two things that Luke tells illustrate loving your neighbor and loving God. He starts by saying the two commandments are to love God and love your neighbor. Here's a parable that tells about loving your neighbor, and here's a story that shows you what it means to love God. So we'll look at those in a minute. In verse 30, Jesus replied and said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers, and they stripped him and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. And by chance a priest was going down on that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan," and we'll pause there for a moment. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was notoriously difficult. It was steep, it was rugged. Jericho was low, Jerusalem was high, so it's a big uphill or downhill climb, whichever way you're going. There were a lot of curves in it and so forth, a lot of places that you could be hidden. So there were, apparently, from what we know historically, a lot of robbers and a lot of assaults and things like that. It was kind of a dangerous place to be walking. And I want you to notice the people who were involved in this story. This is Jesus' parable. This is him telling about the story. He comes up with the story to illustrate the point. But you've got this guy who was attacked. We really don't know much about him, do we? We know he was attacked. We know he was in bad shape. We don't know what his character was like. We don't know what his status was. We don't even know for sure what his race was. We assume a Jew. That's probably mostly who would go down that way. But he doesn't make any point about that. And maybe the point of not telling us more details about the man who was attacked is that it doesn't matter. Love for your neighbor responds to the need, not to who the person is. So it doesn't really matter who he was or what the details were about his life. He needed help. He was beaten up and left half dead. Then you have the two thieves, or the thieves, however many there were, that just used the man and then threw him out. You know, they got what they wanted from him, whatever valuables he had on him, and they just left him alongside the road to die or to get better or whatever would happen. And then you've got the priest and the Levite. They're the wonder in this story, because you would expect the priest and the Levite to be exemplary. You would expect them to be the ones who would show you how to live in loving your neighbor. But they don't. They deliberately steered clear of this guy. They don't lift a finger. Maybe they tried to make it look like they hadn't even noticed him, but they both saw him. They elected to pass by far away from him on the other side, it says. Maybe they had good excuses not to get involved. I mean, they probably had work to do. They probably had families to take care of, whatever. You can think of a lot of things you could say that would justify in your mind just kind of staying away from them. Maybe they used those. When they see him, they both went by on the other side. And then we come in verse 33, but a Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion and came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And he put him on his own beast and brought him to an inn and took care of him. On the next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay you. Now, Jesus is telling this story. I think it's a parable. I think it's a story that he makes up to illustrate the point. So if Jesus is telling the story, he could have told it about a Jew or about anybody else he wanted to tell it about. He told it about the Samaritan. Now, you think about what we know in the Gospels about the Samaritans. You think about John 4 when Jesus was asked water from that Samaritan woman, and talks about how the Jews didn't have any dealings with the Samaritans. She was shocked that Jesus asked her even for water. You don't need us until you need us, and then you want something from us, or whatever she's thinking. In Luke 9, we just saw where James and John wanted to call fire down on the Samaritan village because they wouldn't receive Jesus and his disciples since they were headed toward Jerusalem. And there was not much friendliness between the Jews and the Samaritans. There's a lot of bad blood there. So it's interesting that Jesus chose to make the hero a Samaritan. Seems to me like he was trying to tell us something there. Everybody would have imagined he would be the villain of the story. And he's kind of a brave man. To turn up with a badly wounded Jew thrown across his donkey would invite the idea of maybe he was the one who waylaid him. That's what probably people would think if they saw him carrying this guy. What did he do to him? But he had compassion on him. Here's a man of probably a different race. We're assuming this was a Jew that was beaten up. Would normally have been passing by that road. And here's a Samaritan who cares about this beaten up Jew that he doesn't even know. Well, that's pretty impressive. I don't know how many of us would have that much compassion for somebody that we didn't even like, or we thought we wouldn't. And it's just interesting. And he used his own resources. He used his own oil, his own wine, his own horse, his own money, and had kind of an open-ended monetary arrangement with the innkeeper to spend what he needed on it to get him fixed up. So he showed a lot of compassion. He provided for the care. I mean, he really turns out to be quite the hero in this story. He really showed what it means to be a neighbor. He was willing to do what it took to help the guy. Compassion and love make someone our neighbor, not place or race. Whoever needs my help is my neighbor. A neighbor is not a concept to be debated or defined. It's the guy in the ditch waiting to be served. Who needs our help? That's who the neighbor is. We're not trying to eliminate people from the list of neighbors. We're trying to find who we can serve. And Jesus asked the guy, which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? And he said, the one who showed mercy toward him. Did you notice what he didn't say? He didn't say the Samaritan. He could have said that. No, he doesn't want to say that name, but he says the one who showed mercy for him, which is, of course, true. And, Jesus said, go and do the same. The lesson for this Samaritan, or this lawyer who asked him the question is, you go and do what that Samaritan did. Now, I want you to think about a few things in this story. One is, we really need to avoid stereotyping people based upon their race or other things like that. Jesus could have reversed the characters. He could have told the story with the Samaritan being the one who was hurt and a pious Jew being the one who helped that poor Samaritan. But that's not the way he told that story. They called Jesus a Samaritan in John 8:48 when they were just trying to badmouth him. Oh, you're a Samaritan, you got a demon. That's the worst thing they could think to say about somebody is he was a Samaritan. So why does Jesus choose to make the Samaritan the hero? You can think about passages all throughout the Bible that encourage us to be generous with the people who are in need. In Luke chapter 19 and verse 33, when a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as the native among you. This is Leviticus 19:34. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as a native among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. That was a long time before that, sometime before that, but they were aliens in the land of Egypt. As Moses writes to Leviticus. But you remember what it was like back there, and you depended on the generosity and kindness of Egyptians for any blessing you got. You remember how bad it was when you didn't receive that. You go and do that for those who are foreigners, for those who are strangers, for those who don't belong here. And there's also a really interesting passage in 2 Chronicles chapter 28. In 2 Chronicles chapter 28, you have Pekah and the Israelite kingdom defeating the Jews. They defeat the Jews, they kill 120,000 in one day. That's 2 Chronicles 28:6. And then they took 200,000 captives and brought the spoil to Samaria. And there was a prophet named Oded who told them to take the captives back. They shouldn't capture their own people, the Jews, the people from Judah. Look at this. Just think about the parallels in this. 2 Chronicles 28:15. Then the men who were designated by name arose, took the captives, and they clothed all their naked ones from the spoil. And they gave them clothes and sandals, fed them, gave them drink, anointed them with oil, led all their feeble ones on donkeys, and brought them to Jericho, the city of palm trees, to their brothers. Then they returned to Samaria. You have some people from Samaria doing the Old Testament Good Samaritan story in 2 Chronicles 28:15. I just think that's interesting. So we certainly learn from that we shouldn't stereotype people, and we ought to be kind to people, whoever they are. We're all people. We're all from Adam. We're all from Noah. We've all been strangers in places sometimes and needed help maybe, and somebody's been generous with us. We need to be generous. Another lesson you learn from this story is you need to do what you know. Our relationship needs to God and to others needs to not just be theoretical, but we need to do it. The question is not, can we properly defend who a neighbor is? Do we actually help a neighbor? That's the question. And there are challenges to loving our neighbor. Sometimes it's inconvenient. Sometimes it's dangerous. Sometimes we may feel like the guy's getting what he deserves. Maybe this guy was. I don't know. We don't know what his background was. The Samaritan didn't know what his background was. But it doesn't matter. He needed help. I'd like for you to think of some modern day applications in a spiritual sense. We ought to be willing to help people who are struggling physically and need somebody to intervene. But the more important thing for us to think about is being a good Samaritan to people who are half dead spiritually and who need help to come to the Lord. And you think about what were the keys to this good Samaritan doing the right thing? He had compassion for him. If you saw somebody in a burning house or burning car, and you had some way of getting them out, even at some risk to yourself, you'd probably do it. You'd certainly feel compassion. You'd be upset about it. You'd be worried about it. You'd grieve about it. It takes compassion to motivate us to help somebody. If somebody's lost spiritually, and so many people are, what do we need to do? Feel for them, care about them. If you were them, if you were lost and somebody knew about the Lord and could teach you, would you want them to? We need to have that kind of compassion, that kind of feeling for people, that we love them and we want to serve them by leading to the Lord if they're willing. We seek to do that to the extent they're willing to allow us to. And then the Samaritan did what he could. You know, it's interesting. There is no indication in this story that the Samaritan was a paramedic or a doctor, or he had a fully staffed van with all the latest medical equipment and things like that. He was just a dude going through there. He did what he could with what he had. Maybe he didn't know how to fix some things, but he took him to the innkeeper, hoping the innkeeper could help him along a little bit more. We don't know everything. We can't do everything. We're not skilled at all kinds of spiritual surgeries and things like that. But we can tell what we know. We can share the gospel with people. We may not have all the answers to their questions. Nobody has all the answers to all the questions. But we can point them to the scriptures. We can help sit down and read it with them. And we can help share the Lord with them. And then another thing you see in this Good Samaritan is he took risks. I mean, like I say, somebody might have seen him with that guy and thought he was the one who beat him up. You know, and there had been robbers around there, obviously, by this guy being there. Were they still lurking? If this guy stalls and takes the time to care for this guy and put him on his donkey, will that attract them to come back and hurt him too? You know, sometimes there's risk to take. We risk losing a friendship or being misunderstood or whatever when we try to reach people for the Lord. So we need to be willing to do that. We need to be good Samaritans for our neighbors. And I think spiritually the application is much stronger and needs to be thought about seriously. So that's Jesus' story to illustrate loving your neighbor. But I think this next real story, this is not a parable, illustrates loving God. Now, as they were traveling along, verse 38, he entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister called Mary who was seated at the Lord's feet, listening to his word. But Martha was distracted with all her preparations, and she came up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the serving alone? Then tell her to help me." But the Lord answered and said to her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and bothered about so many things, but only one thing is necessary. For Mary has chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her." That is a challenging story. I think we can see ourselves in both of these characters. You see a lot of good in Martha. She welcomed Jesus into her home. She loved him. She wanted to listen to him. She could have asked him to leave, resenting the extra work and trouble he'd be. But she wanted him to be there. She wanted to be where Mary was, and she wanted to take good care of Jesus, getting a good meal on the table and a good house for him to stay in and all that. But she had some bad qualities. She was distracted with all her preparations. She was preoccupied and overburdened by the things she felt like had to be just right for Jesus. She wanted to get the house just right, probably, the food just right. And, you know, sometimes we do that. There's some good things that sometimes crowd out the better things in our lives. She put too much emphasis on her high standards of housekeeping and food preparation, perhaps, and caused her to neglect something that was even better than that, sitting down and listening to Jesus. Sometimes we do that. Sometimes we take things in this life that are of some value, but not ultimately valuable. We may take our job or our housework or schoolwork or recreation or sports or good causes or whatever that are good things, that are positive things, and make them too important, cause them to crowd out the more important things. She complained. You can understand, it wasn't fair for Mary not to help. You know, I can imagine her pretty frustrated, feeling guilty that she wasn't listening to Jesus, what she wants to do. Envious. Maybe she tried banging on a few kitchen utensils and casting some dirty looks before she finally blurted out what she said. But, you know, it's getting more and more annoying as Mary's just sitting there not helping, and she's got all this work to do. And she finally wanted Jesus to do something about it, to intervene and get Mary to help. She felt pressured. You know, we have high standards sometimes in areas that are less important than sitting down and listening to Jesus. There's nothing wrong with keeping house or making a meal. Sometimes we need to do those things. But when those take precedence over spiritual things, they can cause us to be like Martha. And it's bad enough when you're worried about one thing, but he said you're worried about many things. You got so many things that you're burdened down by that things have to just be perfect in. And, you know, Jesus says only one thing is necessary, for Mary has chosen the good part, which will not be taken away from her. Mary was seated at Jesus' feet. Mary was listening to Jesus. There were things to do, but she only had a few opportunities to listen to Jesus like this. You know, are we too busy to listen to Jesus frequently? Are we too busy to pray to him frequently? Are we too busy to assemble with the saints and prioritize the Lord? You can see Mary made a good choice. She chose the good part. It's going to have to be by choice. There's always going to be competition. There's always going to be good things that are good things that we'd like to do, but that we may not be able to do as much as we want to and still maintain our spiritual life healthy. So we've got to make choices. We have limited time. You know, it's easy to choose the urgent over the important. There's some things that have to be done. If they're going to be done, it's got to be done now. And some of those aren't very important, but they're urgent. And sometimes it's easy to choose the things we can see or other people can see over the things we can't. Who knows whether you prayed today or not? Who knows whether you read the Bible last week or not? You know, who knows how much you thought about the Lord and things like that? Probably nobody. You know, you're not broadcasting that. You're not announcing it. It's easy for us to do the things other people can see rather than the things that are more important. Sometimes we have to reorganize our life and choose the good part. Have we, like Martha, welcomed Christ but not chosen the good part? You know, you just think about how much we need to focus on the things that are not in this life. I think about Colossians chapter 3. Therefore, if you've been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things above, not on the things that are on earth. For you've died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. Making Christ our life, seeking the things above. You know, setting our mind on the things above. That's what Mary had done. And Mary shows what it means to love God. That Samaritan shows what it means to love your neighbor. And Mary shows what it really means to love God. Really challenging stories, both of them are. There's nobody who challenges us as much as Jesus does in what he says. And we've just got a lot to think about, a lot to meditate on, to try to love our neighbors like we ought to and to love God like we should. But those are the two most important commands. If we don't get the top two right, what are we doing? So think about that as we try to make application of this in our life. I'd like to read this last story one more time, and then we'll stand and sing. In Luke chapter 10 and verse 38. Now, as they were traveling along, he entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister called Mary, who was seated at the Lord's feet listening to his word. But Martha was distracted with all her preparations. She came up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister's left me to do all the serving alone? Then tell her to help me." But the Lord answered and said to her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and bothered about so many things, but only one thing is necessary, for Mary has chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her." Let's stand and sing.